For the past few years, I've been working at a small law firm located in an older building in a quiet part of town. The kind of place where the floorboards creak and the lights flicker just a little too often. It's a tiny operation, just 3 lawyers and me, the paralegal. My job is to keep things organized, manage files, and handle whatever the attorneys throw my way. The work is fine, but it's the building that gets to me sometimes. We've always had a janitor who comes in after hours to clean up. I never saw him much, just caught glimpses as I was leaving for the day. A middle-aged guy, a little hunched over, always wearing the same faded uniform. He never said much, just a nod or a quiet "good evening" as I walked out. I didn't think much of it. Then one Monday I noticed something odd. The office was spotless when I came in, as usual, but when I went to the break room, I saw that the trash hadn't been emptied. The trash was always the first thing the janitor handled. I figured maybe he had a rough night and just forgot, so I let it slide. But over the next few days, things got stranger. Trash bins weren't emptied, the floors weren't mopped, and dust started to gather on the desks. I asked the lawyers if they knew what was going on with the janitor, but they all seemed as puzzled as I was. One of them finally decided to call the cleaning company to find out what was going on. After a brief conversation, he hung up, his face pale. They said they haven't sent anyone here in weeks, he told us. The janitor they had assigned to us, he quit over a month ago. We all looked at each other in confusion. That didn't make sense. I'd seen him last week, maybe even a few days ago. But if he had quit, who was the man I'd been seeing? That night I decided to stay late to catch up on some paperwork. The lawyers had left and I was alone in the office. The silence in the building was heavy, almost oppressive. Around 10 p.m., I heard the faint sound of a door closing. I looked up from my desk, heart pounding, and listened. Nothing. I shook my head, trying to brush off the nerves. But then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from down the hallway. My first thought was that one of the lawyers had forgotten something and come back. But when I glanced at the clock, I knew that wasn't possible. They were long gone by now. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My breathing quickened as I strained to hear where they were coming from. They stopped right outside my office door. I froze, staring at the handle, waiting for it to turn. But it didn't. After a moment that felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to get up. I crept to the door, heart thudding in my chest, and slowly opened it. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the flickering overhead lights. I stepped out, looking both ways, but there was no one there. As I stood in the hallway, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard a faint sound, like something dragging across the floor. It was coming from the break room. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to leave, but curiosity and a twisted sense of duty pushed me forward. I walked down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sound grew louder as I approached the break room, a sickening scrape that sent shivers down my spine. I reached the door, which was slightly ajar, and peered inside. At first, I didn't see anything, just the usual clutter of coffee cups and old magazines. But then my eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room where the janitor was standing. He had his back to me, hunched over something on the floor. The scraping noise was coming from him, dragging what looked like a mop across the tiles. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. "Hey," I called out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound calm. "Are you okay?" He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. He just kept dragging that mop back and forth, in a slow, methodical motion. Something about the way he moved was off, almost mechanical. "Hello?" I tried again, stepping into the room. This time, he stopped. The room was deathly silent as he slowly turned his head to look at me. But when he did, my blood ran cold. His eyes were empty, hollow, like dark pits staring back at me. His skin was pale and gaunt, stretched too tightly over his skull, and his mouth was twisted into a grimace, as if he was in pain. I took a step back, instinctively reaching for the door, but he moved faster than I could have imagined. In an instant, he was right in front of me, his hand shooting out to grab my arm. His grip was icy cold, sending a shock of fear through me. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice raspy and filled with something dark, something that made my skin crawl. His breath smelled of decay, and I could feel the chill radiating from his body. I yanked my arm free and bolted out of the room, not daring to look back. I sprinted down the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears, and didn't stop until I was out of the building and into the cold night air. I jumped into my car and sped away, my mind racing with what had just happened. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to go back to the office. I called in sick and spent the day locked in my apartment, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. When I finally went back a few days later, I was told that the janitor had been found dead in his apartment. He had passed away weeks ago. I never worked late again. To this day, I still don't know who or what was in that building with me that night. But one thing is certain. It wasn't the janitor I had seen all those nights before. Working the night shift at a 24-hour gas station wasn't my first choice. But with bills piling up and no other job offers, I didn't have much of an option. It was a small station on the edge of town, the kind of place that only saw a handful of customers between midnight and dawn. Most nights, I was alone, with nothing but the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional ding of the door chime to keep me company. The station was surrounded by thick woods on three sides, with only the highway cutting through the darkness in front. During the day, it wasn't so bad, but at night, the trees seemed to close in, making the place feel isolated, like a little bubble of light in an ocean of black. My shift started at 11 p.m., and it was always the same routine. Check the registers, restock the snacks, clean the counters, and wait for morning. But one night, things felt off. It was late November, and the first snow of the season had just started falling. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows and making the old building creak. Around 2 a.m., after an hour of no customers, I started to feel that familiar heaviness in my eyelids. I brewed a pot of coffee, hoping it would keep me awake. When I heard it, a soft tapping sound, almost like fingers drumming against glass. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I looked around. The station was empty, but the tapping continued, steady and rhythmic. It was coming from the front window. I slowly walked around the counter, trying to peer through the glass. At first, all I saw was my own reflection, but then the motion-activated lights outside flickered on, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing just outside the window, barely visible through the swirling snow. It was a man, or at least I thought it was. He was tall, with a hood pulled low over his face, and he was tapping on the glass with one long, bony finger. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching. I stumbled back, my heart racing. This wasn't normal. No one should have been out in that weather, especially not in the middle of the night, miles away from the nearest town. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. The operator's voice crackled through the receiver, calm and steady. I tried to explain what was happening, but before I could finish, the lights in the station flickered and then went out, plunging the place into darkness. I was left standing there, phone in hand, with nothing but the howling wind and the sound of my own breathing. The line went dead. Panic set in. I grabbed the flashlight I kept under the counter and flicked it on, the weak beam barely cutting through the darkness. I pointed it toward the window, but the figure was gone. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I backed away, trying to think, trying to figure out what to do. My car was parked in the lot out front, but that meant going outside, where it was. The emergency exit was at the back, but it was always locked from the outside, and I didn't want to trap myself in a dead end. Then I heard it, a soft shuffling sound coming from the back of the station near the storage room. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned the flashlight toward the noise. The beam flickered and dimmed, but I caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. Someone, or something, was inside the station. I backed up against the counter, my breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The shuffling grew louder, closer, until I could hear it just beyond the door to the storage room. I knew I had to do something, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The door creaked open, and I saw a shadow slip into the room. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Its head was bent at an odd angle, as if it couldn't quite fit through the doorway. I could hear it breathing, a low, raspy sound that sent chills down my spine. Then, in the dim light of the dying flashlight, I saw its face. Or rather, where its face should have been. It was just blank, like a smooth piece of pale, stretched skin. No eyes, no mouth, nothing. It took a step toward me, and I snapped out of my paralysis, adrenaline kicking in. I turned and ran for the emergency exit, praying it would open. The thing moved behind me, its footsteps slow and deliberate, almost like it was toying with me. I hit the door hard, fumbling with the latch, and by some miracle, it gave way. I stumbled out into the freezing night, the wind cutting through me like a knife. I didn't stop running until I reached the highway, where a passing truck driver finally stopped to help me. The police searched the station, but they didn't find anything. No sign of forced entry, no footprints in the snow, nothing on the security cameras, which had conveniently malfunctioned during my shift. They said it was probably just a prank, someone trying to scare me. But I know what I saw. I never went back to that gas station. A week later, I heard it had shut down. The official story was that the owner couldn't keep up with the costs. But I think it was something else. Something that wasn't meant to be found, and something that should never be disturbed. To this day, I can't drive past a gas station at night without feeling that same cold dread. The feeling that somewhere out there in the dark, it's still watching, waiting for someone to make the same mistake I did. Marcus had been struggling to find steady work for months when he finally landed a job as a night security guard at an old, mostly abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to get by. The warehouse had been used for various businesses over the years, but now it was just a storage space for unused machinery and office furniture. It seemed like an easy gig. Walk the perimeter, check the cameras, and make sure nothing was amiss. For the first few weeks, Marcus settled into the quiet routine. His nights were uneventful, with nothing but the distant hum of traffic on the nearby highway and the occasional rustle of wind through the surrounding trees. The warehouse was enormous, filled with rows of dusty, unused equipment and forgotten boxes stacked high on industrial racks. The only light came from the few dim bulbs spaced out across the ceiling, casting long, eerie shadows. One night, as Marcus was doing his usual rounds, he noticed something strange. One of the doors at the far end of the building was slightly ajar. He was sure he had locked it earlier, so he walked over to check it out. As he approached, the door creaked open a little more, as if someone had just pushed it from the outside. Marcus stopped in his tracks, a chill running down his spine. He stepped outside and shone his flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing out there. Just the empty lot surrounded by tall, swaying grass. He shook off the unease, thinking maybe the door hadn't latched properly when he'd locked it earlier. After securing it again, he went back inside, but the nagging feeling of something being off lingered. As he returned to the security office, the sound of a door slamming shut echoed through the warehouse. Marcus froze, his heart pounding. He hadn't heard anyone come in. Slowly, he turned around and scanned the darkened aisles of the warehouse, but all he saw were more shadows. Taking a deep breath, he told himself it was probably just a draft and continued to the office. Once inside, he locked the door behind him and sat down in front of the monitors. The cameras were positioned to cover the entire warehouse, but the grainy, black and white footage made it hard to see anything clearly. He began switching through the feeds, searching for any sign of movement. As he cycled through, something caught his eye. On one of the monitors, there was a shadow that didn't belong. Marcus leaned in closer, trying to make out what it was. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. A dark figure standing between two rows of shelves, barely visible. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there watching. He quickly switched to the next camera angle, hoping to get a better look, but by the time the image loaded, the figure was gone. Panic began to set in. Was it just his imagination? Or was there really someone inside the warehouse with him? Marcus forced himself to stay calm and decided to check the area. He grabbed his flashlight and cautiously opened the office door, stepping into the cold, silent warehouse. The air felt heavy, like something was watching him from the shadows. He moved slowly, shining his light down each row as he passed, but everything seemed normal. Dusty shelves, old crates, and rows of forgotten machinery. When he reached the spot where he'd seen the figure on the camera, he found nothing. But as he turned to leave, something scraped against the concrete floor behind him. Marcus spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there, only the echo of the sound lingering in the vast space. He took a step back, suddenly aware of how isolated he was. The warehouse felt different now, more oppressive, as if the darkness itself had come alive. He quickened his pace, heading back toward the security office. The sound of footsteps followed him, soft at first, then growing louder and more frantic, matching his own steps. Marcus broke into a run, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear the footsteps right behind him now, almost on top of him. He didn't dare look back, fearing what he might see. He reached the office door and slammed it shut behind him, locking it as fast as his shaking hands would allow. He collapsed into the chair, his eyes darting to the monitors. The cameras showed nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. But he knew he wasn't alone. The footsteps had been real, and whoever or whatever was out there was still in the warehouse, hidden in the shadows. Marcus grabbed the phone and dialed 911, his voice trembling as he explained the situation. The operator assured him that officers were on their way, but it would take them at least 10 minutes to arrive. 10 minutes felt like an eternity. He hung up the phone and stared at the door, his mind racing. The warehouse was deathly quiet now, the only sound his own rapid breathing. Then the doorknob started to turn, slowly, deliberately. Marcus's heart stopped. He watched in horror as the door creaked open, just a crack, enough to see the darkened hallway beyond. The shadow moved again, this time slipping inside the room. It was a man, his face obscured by the darkness, but Marcus could see the glint of something metallic in his hand. A knife. The man stepped closer, the blade catching the dim light from the monitors. Marcus scrambled backward, knocking over the chair as he went. The man didn't say a word, just kept advancing, the knife held out in front of him. Marcus was cornered, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He pressed himself against the wall, his mind screaming for a way out. Just as the man reached him, the sound of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder by the second. The man hesitated, then turned and bolted out the door. Marcus watched in disbelief as the figure disappeared into the darkness of the warehouse. Seconds later, the police burst in, guns drawn. They searched the entire warehouse, but there was no sign of the intruder. The only evidence they found was a single deep scratch on the security office door, right where the knife had been. Marcus didn't wait to hear the results of the investigation. He handed in his resignation the next day, leaving the warehouse and its shadows behind. But the memory of that night stayed with him, a constant reminder that sometimes the darkness hides more than just shadows.